Every great house has its secrets. Every duchess was once a woman the world refused to see. And every love worth telling begins the moment someone breaks the rules. The Queen of England had selected 15 brides for him. 15 of the wealthiest, most beautiful, most carefully bred young women in the kingdom. Each one assembled in white silk in the royal drawing room of St. James's Palace. Each one curtsying in turn, each one waiting to be chosen. The Duke of Ashbourne walked past every single one of them. He did not look at the heiress with £30,000 a year. He did not look at the Earl of Sutherland's daughter, whose mother had married a prince. He did not look at the famous beauty whose portrait had hung in every drawing room in London for 2 seasons. He stopped in front of the small writing desk in the corner of the room. Behind it sat the court chronicler, a woman in dark gray wool, a widow, 28 years old, the person whose job was to record the proceedings of state ceremonies, and who had been so invisible to the court for 5 years that not one of the 15 heiresses had noticed her in the room. He said, "I came to marry Eleanor Vane, or no one." She did not gasp, she did not weep. She set down her pen very carefully, and she looked at him with the face of a woman who had been waiting, for 5 years, for him to find her. She knew exactly who he was. She had been hiding from him. The royal drawing room of St. James's Palace at 9:30 in the evening, 15 unmarried young women stood in a single line that ran the length of the room. White silk. Every one of them. Pearls. Every one of them. Hair dressed identically by the same 3 royal coiffeurs the Queen had hired for the occasion. It had been called the bridal audience. The Queen had announced it 3 weeks earlier. The Duke of Ashbourne had returned from 4 years of war in Spain. He was now 36 years old, unmarried, in possession of the largest unentailed fortune in the southern counties, and, by royal decree, required to produce an heir within 18 months. The Queen, who was a thorough woman, had simplified the process. She had collected every eligible heiress in England. She had arranged them in a line. She had ordered them not to speak unless spoken to. She had told the Duke to walk the line and to indicate, by the smallest gesture, his choice. The Queen sat on the dais at the head of the room, a small jeweled writing tablet on her knee, in case it was necessary to record his answer. The Duke arrived 9 minutes late. He did not look like a man who had been in a war. He had been clean-shaven that morning. His coat was a deep charcoal silk. He wore the peninsular star at his throat. He bowed to the Queen. He did not bow to the heiresses. The Queen, who had not slept 3 hours the night before, leaned forward. "Your Grace, we are ready." The Duke straightened. He looked at the line of 15 young women. He looked at the Queen. He said, "Your Majesty, with respect, I have a name." The room stopped. The Queen's writing tablet stopped. "A name? Yes." "Speak it, Your Grace." He shook his head once. "Not yet. Permit me first to walk the line." The Queen narrowed her eyes, but she nodded. He walked the line. The first heiress was Lady Charlotte Bevington, daughter of the Marquis of Bevington. £30,000 a year. Auburn hair. He stopped. He bowed. He moved on. The second was Lady Honoria Pierce, whose mother had been First Lady of the Bedchamber. He stopped. He bowed. He moved on. By the 4th heiress, Lady Charlotte Bevington had begun to weep silently. By the 7th, a stir had begun to move through the court. By the 11th, Miss Anne Crawley, whose father owned 3 counties, the Earl of Bevington, had risen from his seat at the back of the room. "Your Grace." The Duke did not look at him. He walked past the 12th heiress. He walked past the 13th. He walked past the 14th. He stopped at the 15th. Lady Sophia Hartwell. He stopped a full 3 seconds. He looked at her face. She lifted her chin. She believed she had won. He bowed. He walked past her. The Queen rose from her dais. "Your Grace." The Duke turned. He turned toward the back of the room. There was a small writing desk in the corner near the south window, 2 candles on it, a neatly stacked pile of paper, an inkwell, a goosefeather pen. Behind the desk sat a woman in dark gray wool. She was bent over her writing. She had not lifted her head once during the entire proceeding. She had been transcribing in silence for the past hour. She had recorded, in her careful round hand, the names of all 15 heiresses, the times of their curtsies, the gestures of the Duke. She had recorded, 11 minutes earlier, that his grace declined to indicate a preference. She did not yet know that he had stopped walking. He crossed the room. He stopped 6 paces from her desk. He said, very quietly, "Mrs. Vane?" Eleanor Vane set down her pen. She did not look up at first. She had heard him say her name. She had heard him say it the way one says a name one has been holding silently for a long time, and she knew, in the moment between his voice and her own breath, that the next 5 minutes would either destroy her or save her. She looked up. She did not recognize him visibly. She had become, in 5 years, the kind of woman who showed nothing. The Duke went very still. She said, "Your Grace, I am writing." The Duke bowed. Then he turned to the Queen. "Your Majesty, I came tonight to marry Mrs. Vane. I will marry her, or no one." The Queen sat down very slowly. The Earl of Bevington made a sound like a wounded animal. Lady Sophia Hartwell, the 15th heiress, fainted. Mrs. Vane folded her hands on top of her unfinished page. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at the candle on her desk. She had known he would come. She had not known he would do it this loudly. Eleanor was taken from the drawing room within the minute, not by the Duke, by 2 of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, with their hands on her elbows, not unkindly, but not gently either. She was walked down a corridor she knew well. She had walked it twice a week for 5 years. She passed the portrait of the dead Queen Caroline. She passed the marble bust of King William III. She passed the closet where the dictation girls had their morning tea. She was a clerk being escorted. She had been a clerk for 5 years. She had been other things before. The ladies took her to the Queen's private antechamber. They left her standing in the center of the room. They did not offer her a chair. They went out and closed the door behind them. Eleanor stood. She did not move. She had not yet allowed herself, since hearing the Duke speak her name, to breathe properly. She breathed now. The fire crackled in the grate. She thought of her daughter, Catherine, 6 years old, asleep at this moment in their lodging in Smithfield, their 2 rooms above the bookseller's shop, the bed they shared because there was only one, the candle Eleanor lit every evening so Catherine would not be afraid. She thought, if I do this wrong, I lose her. The Queen came in alone. Queen Charlotte was 72 years old, pale skin, watery, clever eyes, a heavy gown of dark green velvet. She closed the door behind her. She crossed the room to the fire. She did not sit. "Mrs. Vane, Your Majesty, you will tell me, at once, what you are to the Duke of Ashbourne." Eleanor looked at the Queen. She did not lie. She did not weep. She did not, after 5 years of being invisible, suddenly become a different woman. "Your Majesty, I knew the Duke before my marriage. I have not spoken to him in 8 years. 8 years? Yes. He has just told my drawing room that he will marry you, or no one. Yes. You expected this." A pause. "I expected it 3 years ago, Your Majesty. When I stopped expecting it, I was relieved. I had built a life I could survive. Tonight he has come to take it apart. I did not know how to stop him." The Queen looked at her a long time. "You have a child." "I have a daughter, Catherine. She is 6. Her father, my husband, was killed at Trafalgar. Captain Edward Vane, HMS Berwick, boarded by the French, ordered the ship not to surrender, died on the quarterdeck." Eleanor did not move. "Your Majesty knows. I was Queen when he died. I attended the memorial. I read his commendation." Eleanor's mouth, for the first time that evening, moved. It was not a smile. It was the involuntary motion of a woman who had been told for 5 years that no one remembered. "Yes, Your Majesty, he died well." The Queen sat down. She looked at the fire. She said after a long moment, "Mrs. Vane, I have made a mistake. Waiting tonight. I do not often, but I have made one. I assumed, when I arranged the bridal audience, that a man newly returned from 4 years of war would be grateful for a wife chosen by his sovereign. I did not pause to ask him whether there was already a name. There was. There is. You. The Duke of Ashbourne is a man who does not arrive 9 minutes late by accident. He arrived 9 minutes late because he was waiting until the room was full enough that no one could pretend it had not happened. He has done a thing tonight that cannot be undone. The question is whether you will undo it for him. Will you?" Eleanor did not answer at first. She thought of the candle in Smithfield, burning beside Catherine's sleeping face. She thought of the bookseller downstairs, who would, in 2 weeks, ask her for next month's rent. She thought of her husband's family, who had not spoken her name in 5 years. She thought of the 4-year war the Duke had been in, of the 4-year silence between them, of the letter he had written her 8 years ago, on the night before she married Edward Vane, a letter she had not opened, a letter she had carried in her trunk for 8 years. She had told herself she would burn it. She had not burnt it. She said, "Your Majesty, I would like, if it is permitted, to speak to the Duke first." The Queen nodded once. "It is permitted. He is in the corridor. He has not moved since you left the room. He is waiting for you." What happened next is the part of the story I have been waiting 8 years to tell you. The part where a widow with nothing but a 6-year-old daughter and a borrowed morning gown walked out of a Queen's antechamber to meet a man who had just publicly defied the Crown of England for her. The part where she learned, in the next 11 minutes, what he had been doing for 4 years in Spain. The part where she understood, finally, why she had been hiding. I am going to tell you everything. The letter she had not opened. The letters he had written but never sent. The truth her husband had told her on the morning he sailed. The reason the Duke had needed exactly 4 years to come back for her. If you want to hear the rest, and trust me, you want to hear the rest, stay with me. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story. We tell a new one every 2 days, slowly, beautifully, without apology. And in the comments, before you go further, tell me one thing. Were you the widow the world forgot? The woman the room walked past? The one no one came back for? Eleanor thought she was the only one. She was not. And neither are you. He was standing in the corridor outside the antechamber. He had not moved. He had not, since she walked into the antechamber 40 minutes earlier, sat down. He had not paced. He had not spoken to the 2 footmen at the corridor's far end, who had spent 40 minutes pretending not to watch him. He had not even removed his gloves. He had stood, watching the door. When the door opened, he looked up immediately. His face, when he saw her step into the corridor, did something Eleanor had not seen any face do in 5 years. It softened. It opened. Some small, fierce private piece of the man who had stood in the drawing room and named her in front of the Queen surrendered, and what was left was a face she had known when she was 20. He did not approach. He waited. She closed the door behind her. She walked the length of the corridor slowly. The marble was cold through her thin slippers. She stopped 4 paces from him. "Mrs. Vane, Your Grace, Stop." He stopped. She said, "If you are about to apologize, do not. If you are about to explain yourself, do not. I have one question. I would like you to answer it before either of us says anything else. Ask, did you know I was the chronicler?" He looked at her. "Yes. You knew when you walked into the drawing room tonight. I knew when the Queen first announced the bridal audience 3 weeks ago. I made inquiries. I asked the Lord Chamberlain. I confirmed that the woman who recorded state ceremonies was you. I have known for 3 weeks that you would be in that room tonight. I chose to make my position public in the moment because I wished you to have witnesses. I wished it not to be a matter of his word against hers if you were displeased. You did not, at any point, consider asking me first. I considered it for 2 weeks. I rejected it. Why?" He drew a breath. "Eleanor, there are 43 letters in a locked drawer in my study at Ashbourne Hall. I wrote one to you every Christmas Eve and one every May the 7th, your birthday, for 8 years. 43 letters. I did not send a single one, not one. I did not send them because, every time, I was afraid you would not write back. I told myself I was protecting you. I was not. I was protecting myself from the silence. I have been a coward for 8 years, Eleanor. Last night I decided, finally, that I would rather be publicly humiliated by you than privately ignored for 1 more year. So, I did not ask you first, because I could not give myself the option of being ignored again." She stared at him. 43 letters, 43. You did not send them. I did not. Adrian, don't, Eleanor. Please don't comfort me. I do not deserve comfort for it. I have wasted 8 years of both our lives because I was afraid of a letter going unanswered. I am not asking you to forgive that. I am telling you so you know what kind of man you are deciding about." Eleanor closed her eyes. She had forgotten, in 8 years, how he spoke. He spoke the way a man writes a will, every word weighed, every sentence final. She opened her eyes. Your Grace. Eleanor, do you know what I have been doing for 5 years? I know parts of it. I have been writing names in books, every day, the names of women presented at court, the names of viscounts being knighted. I have written down approximately 240,000 names in 5 years. I have a daughter. I have rent due in 14 days. I have a husband's family that pretends I'm dead. I have built, Your Grace, I have built a life in which I do not have to want anything I cannot have. And tonight, in front of 15 heiresses and the Queen and 300 witnesses, you have walked into the only quiet room I have ever managed to make for myself, and you have set fire to it. Did you understand what you were burning? He looked at her. His face did not move. He said, Eleanor, I have spent 4 years in Spain. I have seen what fire is. I would not set fire to anything of yours by accident. I knew exactly what I was burning. I did it on purpose, because there is a thing under it that I want very badly to give back to you, and I have not in 8 years found another way. She was silent a long moment. She said, What is the thing? He said, The first letter. The one I wrote you the night before you married Edward Vane. The one I actually sent. She went very still. What letter? I know you did not read it. How? Because I am still alive, Eleanor. If you had read it, you would not have married him. You would have come to me. Therefore, you did not read it. Therefore, for 8 years, I have been the only person in England who knows what I wrote. And what I wrote, Eleanor, is the only thing that has kept me alive on 3 different battlefields. I would like, before either of us is older, to put it in your hands. Whatever you do with it afterward, read it or burn it, is yours. But it is yours. I am tired, Eleanor, of being the only person who carries it. He took, from the inside pocket of his coat, a folded square of paper. It was old. The seal was broken. He had broken it himself 8 years ago, before sending it. The paper was yellow at the folds. It had been carried in his coat through 4 years in Spain. It had been wet. It had been burnt at one corner. He held it out. He did not move toward her. She crossed the 4 paces. She took the letter. She did not open it. She put it in the inside pocket of her gown, the pocket she had sewn into every gown she had owned for 5 years, the one where she kept Catherine's small drawings, and she closed her hand over it for a moment, holding it against her ribs where her own heart was. She looked up at him. She said, I have a daughter, Your Grace. He said, I know. Her name is Catherine. She is 6. She has her father's dark hair and her mother's eyes. Mrs. Walker, the bookseller's wife, takes her on Wednesdays when you go to the palace. She likes pears, and she is afraid of large dogs. I have not spoken to her, but I have asked. I have asked Eleanor for some time. Eleanor lifted her chin, the smallest motion, and she said, I will read the letter tonight, and tomorrow morning I will give you my answer. If my answer is no, you will go. You will not come back. You will not write again. You will accept that the woman you wrote that letter to does not any more exist. If your answer is no, I will accept it. I will go. I will not write. Do not tell me yes, Eleanor, because you think I cannot survive a no. I have survived 4 years of worse. She nodded once. She turned away. She walked back down the long corridor toward the antechamber. Halfway down she stopped. She did not turn around. She said over her shoulder, in a voice he had to strain to hear, Captain Edward Vane was a good man. I will not have him spoken of badly. Whatever is in that letter, whatever you wrote about him 8 years ago, I will not have him spoken of badly. Do you understand me, Your Grace? The Duke of Ashbourne, who had stood at attention through 3 field commissions, who had not flinched at Albuera, who had once told a Spanish colonel to go to hell in 3 languages, bowed in the empty corridor at her back. I understand, Mrs. Vane. Good. She continued walking. She did not look back. It was the morning of October the 3rd, 1805. The Honorable Adrian Carlyle, not yet a duke, his father was still alive, sat at the writing desk in his rooms at Albany. He had not slept. He had been writing the letter for 9 hours. He had drafted it 11 times. The 11 discarded drafts were burnt in the grate. The 12th draft was 11 lines. He stared at it. His brother Hugh, 3 years his junior, in a dressing gown, half amused, half impatient, leaned in the doorway. "Adrian, the bells start at 11. You will be late if you do not dress." "I am not going." "You are going. You are her oldest friend. Her father invited you. You cannot not go." Adrian did not look up. "Hugh, I have just written the letter. The one I told you about. I have written it. It is finished." Hugh came into the room. He sat down on the corner of the desk. He read the letter upside down, the way younger brothers read letters they are not meant to read. When he had finished, he was silent a long moment. He said, "Adrian, if you send this, you will ruin her wedding day. She will read it. She will know. She will marry him anyway because she has to. And she will spend the rest of her life knowing what she gave up." "I know. That is a cruel letter, Adrian. I know that too." "Then do not send it." Adrian looked up at his brother. He said, "Hugh, I have spent 6 months not sending letters to her. I have not sent a letter every day since her engagement was announced. I have written every one. I have burnt every one. I cannot Dan let her go without her knowing. I will be a worse man for the rest of my life if I let her go without her knowing. I will send this one. I will let her decide what to do with it. That is the only choice I have, Hugh, that I can live with." Hugh looked at him. Hugh, who was 25 and who would in 5 years be killed by a fall from a horse at Newmarket and would never marry, said, "Then send it now, before the bells, so she has time to choose." Adrian sealed the letter with his father's dragon seal. He broke the seal himself because, at 28, the act of unsealing it himself felt necessary, the only honest gesture he could make in a letter built of dishonest hope. He pressed the broken seal back together. He sent it by the fastest boy in the Albany stables. The boy reached Eleanor's mother's house at 20 past 10. The bells of St. George's, Hanover Square, began to ring at 11. At 11:15, in the vestry, Eleanor Hampshire, 20 years old, in ivory silk, holding a small posy of late roses, was handed a folded paper by her mother. "I do not know what he writes, child. I do not wish to know. Read it or burn it. But if you read it, you must promise me that you will burn it afterward, because it cannot help you and it cannot save you, and it can only break the heart of a man tomorrow who deserves better than to be married by half a wife." Eleanor took the letter. She did not read it. She did not burn it. She slid it into the small embroidered pocket of her wedding gown, the pocket her grandmother had sewn there in case she needed to carry a handkerchief, and she walked down the aisle. Captain Edward. Vane was waiting at the altar, 26 years old, in his dress uniform, the peninsular star not yet on his throat. He had not yet served. He had not yet sailed. He would be dead in 11 months. He smiled when he saw her. She smiled back. She married him. And the letter, the 12th draft, sealed with the dragon seal of the Marquis of Ashbourne, the seal broken by the sender's own thumb, went into her trunk that night and stayed there for 8 years. That was the morning Adrian Carlyle became, by his own choice, a man who had let her go. It was also the morning he became, for the next 8 years, a man who would write 43 more letters and send none of them. He had decided that one was enough. He had been wrong. Eleanor was home by midnight. The Duke had paid for a hackney carriage. He had not got into it himself. He had simply, when she came back out of the Queen's antechamber, instructed a palace footman to find her a private carriage and to deposit her at the precise door of her precise lodging in Smithfield, without question and without comment. Eleanor had not taken his coat. She had got into the carriage alone. She had not opened the letter on the ride home. She climbed the narrow back stairs above Walker's bookshop. The shop was dark. Mrs. Walker had left the small lamp burning at the landing. Eleanor took it. She unlocked her door. She closed it behind her. She locked it. She crossed to the inner room where Catherine slept. Catherine was curled in the center of the bed they shared, one hand under her cheek, her dark hair tangled across the pillow. She was breathing softly. Mrs. Walker had put a small wooden bird on the pillow beside her, a thing Catherine had been carrying everywhere for a year. Eleanor stood looking at her daughter. She felt the letter through the fabric of her gown. She also felt, in the inner pocket of the gown, against the new letter, a second piece of paper, older, folded smaller, more worn. She had carried it for 5 years. She had not, in 5 years, needed to read it. She had memorized it the morning her husband had pressed it into her hand on the deck of HMS Berwick at Portsmouth. She took both letters out. She crossed back to the front room. She lit a second candle. She put both letters on the small wooden table. Then she sat down and read the one she had carried for 8 years. The handwriting was Ashbourne's, younger then, less measured, the strokes still slightly wild. The ink was brown with age. The paper had been wet at least once. There were 11 lines. She read them. When she had finished, she sat very still. She read them again. The third time she put down the page, and she said, out loud, in her small kitchen, to no one, "Oh!" Catherine stirred in the next room. "Mama? Go back to sleep, my love. I am only awake." "Are you crying?" Eleanor laughed. It surprised her. It surprised Catherine, too. Eleanor heard her daughter sit up in the bed. "Mama? I am not crying, my love. I am only reading. Go to sleep." There was a small silence. Then, was the man at the palace nice? Eleanor froze. Catherine, 6 years old, who heard everything because she had grown up in 2 rooms with a working mother and a thin floor, called from the inner room, sleepily, factually, "Mrs. Walker says a duke came tonight. She said he asked you to marry him. In front of 15 ladies. She said the cook's daughter ran all the way from Pall Mall to tell her, because it is in the early papers. She said it is the most exciting thing that has ever happened in this house." Eleanor began to laugh. It built. It became helpless. She put her head down on the table beside both letters and laughed until she could not stop. Catherine padded out of the inner room in her nightdress, climbed into Eleanor's lap, looked at her mother's wet face with grave 6-year-old concern. "Mama, was the Duke nice?" Eleanor lifted her daughter onto her lap. She wrapped her arms around her. She said, "Yes, Catherine, he was very nice." "Are you going to marry him?" Eleanor looked over her daughter's dark head at the 2 letters on the table. She had not yet looked at Edward's. She had memorized it. She did not need to read it, but she reached for it anyway. She unfolded it. She put it on the table beside the Duke's letter. Both letters lay open on the table together. For the first time in 8 years. Edward. Vane's handwriting was square and naval, 5 lines. Dated Portsmouth, the morning of October the 20th, 1805, the morning he had sailed, 3 days before Trafalgar. Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am dead. Listen. The cat will be sad. The daughter will be sadder. You will be saddest of all. Bear it, my dear. Then, when you can, marry again. Find a man who has been waiting for you. I think you know who. I am not jealous. I have never been. He wrote you a letter 8 years ago. You did not open it. You should. He is a better correspondent than I am. He is also patient. I am, Eleanor, I am content. Take care of the cat. Take care of the daughter. Take care of yourself, in that order. Spend the money, read the books, marry him. I love you. Edward. Catherine, on Eleanor's lap, could not yet read so well as she pretended to. She squinted at the 2 pages. She said, "Mama, are those 2 letters from 2 different men?" Eleanor said, "Yes, Catherine." "Are they about each other?" Eleanor looked at the table. She put her hand on top of Edward's letter, gently. "The way one places a hand on a friend's shoulder in church," she said. "Yes, Catherine, they are." "Did they know each other?" "No, they did not." "How is that possible?" Eleanor was quiet a long moment. She said, "Catherine, Sometimes the people who love you most know things about you that they have never been told. Your father knew. He knew in the way good men know things, that someone had been writing me letters for years. He did not ask me. He did not need to. He told me, on the morning he sailed, that when I was ready, I should go and find him. The Duke did not know that. The Duke has spent 8 years thinking he was alone and waiting for me. He was not. Your father was waiting for me, too. From the other side. Catherine considered this. She said, "Mama, that is a nice story." Eleanor laughed. She kissed the top of her daughter's head. She said, "Yes, Catherine, it is. Are you going to marry the Duke?" "I am going to marry the Duke, Catherine." "Tomorrow?" "Soon." "Will we live in a house with horses?" "Yes, Catherine, we will." "Will Lord Byron come?" "Lord Byron will come." Catherine settled against her mother's chest. She was already half asleep. She said, very faintly into Eleanor's collarbone, "Mama, tell the Duke about Papa's letter. He should know." Eleanor closed her eyes. She said, "I will, Catherine. I will tell him in the morning." She carried her daughter back to bed. She blew out the candles. She did not sleep. She sat at the table in the dark until dawn, with one hand on each letter. Adrian's 8 years old, Edward's 5, and she felt, for the first time in 8 years, that she had been loved by two good men, and neither of them, in any way that mattered, had stood in the other's way. At dawn, she heated water on the stove and washed her face. She put on her best dark gray wool, the one without the ink stains. She folded Edward's letter carefully and slid it back into the inner pocket of her gown. She did not bring Adrian's letter. She did not need to carry it anymore. She knew now what it said. She left it on the center of the table, on top of the small wooden bird Catherine had given her. She walked to St. James's Palace. The Duke was waiting at the side gate. He had been waiting since 5 o'clock. He had not slept either. She crossed the courtyard to him. She stopped 3 paces from him. She did not this time lift her chin in defense. She lifted it the way one lifts one's face to the morning. She said, "Yes." He went very still. "Eleanor. Adrian." His name was Adrian. She had remembered this in the corridor last night. She had not, in 8 years, said it aloud. She said it now. "There is something you need to know first, before either of us is older." "Yes. My husband, Captain Edward Vane, wrote me a letter the morning he sailed, 3 days before Trafalgar. I have carried it for 5 years. He told me, in 5 lines, that when I was ready I should come and find you. He said you had been writing me letters for years. He said you were patient. He said he was content." The Duke did not move. He did not breathe. She continued, "He knew, Adrian. I do not know how he knew. I never told him. I had never opened your letter. But he knew. He had been telling me for 5 years that I was permitted to marry you. I had not for 5 years allowed myself to hear it. Last night I read both letters together. They lay on the same table. They were both my permissions. I do not need permission from men. But I have had it, from 2 of them, for 5 years. And I have wasted those 5 years." She paused. "I am not going to waste another morning, Adrian." The Duke of Ashbourne, who had marched 400 miles in retreat from Burgos, who had been brevet promoted in the field at Vittoria, who had survived a saber cut to the shoulder at Toulouse, did the thing he had not done in any of those 4 years. He sat down. He sat down on the cold flagstone of the courtyard. He put his head in his hands. He did not weep. He simply sat for the time it took a man to absorb the information that the husband of the woman he had loved for 16 years had, on the morning of his death, given him permission. When he could speak again, he said, "Captain Vane was a better man than I have been. He was a good man, Adrian, different from you, not better, different. And he loved me well, and you have loved me well. I have been a fortunate woman. I have not understood it until this morning." She walked to him. She put her hand on top of his head, gently, the way one puts a hand on the head of a son or a brother. She said, "Get up, Adrian. We are going to tell my husband's family. Then we are going to tell my daughter. Then we are going to tell the Queen, in that order. I have a great deal to do today." He rose. He took her hand. She did not let it go. The Vane house was in Cavendish Square. It was a tall, narrow Georgian house, faced in pale stone, 4 stories. The front door was painted a deep brittle black. There was a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Eleanor had not stood on this doorstep in 5 years. She lifted the knocker. She let it fall. The footman who answered was new. He did not know her. He looked at her gray wool gown and at the tall man beside her in a dark coat and the peninsular star. "Madam, Mrs. Edward Vane, to see the Dowager Lady Vane. She is at home every morning between 7 and 9. Please tell her ladyship that her daughter-in-law is in the hall. Tell her that I have brought a witness. Tell her that I shall not be long." The footman went up the stairs. The Dowager Lady Vane received them in the morning room. She was 68 years old. She had hair the color of cold ash, and the bones of a woman who had once been very beautiful. She had loved her son. She had not, Eleanor knew, had known for 5 years, ever loved her son's wife. She did not rise when Eleanor came in. "Eleanor, Lady Vane, may I introduce His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne?" Lady Vane's eyes moved to the Duke. She rose. She had risen, in 50 years of public life, for very few people. She rose for a duke. "Your Grace." "Lady Vane," Eleanor said. "Lady Vane, I shall not waste your morning. I came to tell you that I am going to marry the Duke of Ashbourne. We shall be married in 3 weeks. I came to tell you in person because I lived in your house for 2 years, and because, whatever has come between us since, it was here that I last saw your son. I should be honored if you would attend the wedding. I have brought his grace as a witness because I wished, for the rest of my life, to know that I had asked you in front of someone who could remember whether you said yes." The Dowager Lady Vane stared at her. She set down the small gray terrier on the couch. She crossed the room, slowly, the way an old woman crosses a room, and she stood directly in front of Eleanor. She said very quietly, "Did my son know?" "Yes, Lady Vane. He knew. He asked me, the week before our wedding, whether there had been a name. I told him yes. He asked me whether the name was over. I told him yes. He believed me. I had believed me. I had not opened a letter for 8 years. I did not know, Lady Vane, until this morning, what I had been carrying. This morning, Lady Vane, your son wrote me a letter the morning he sailed. He told me, when I was ready, to marry the Duke. I read it again last night. I was ready this morning." The Dowager Lady Vane put one hand to her mouth. She said, "Edward did what?" "He gave me permission, Lady Vane. He gave it to me 5 years ago. I have only just understood that I had it." Lady Vane sat down on the small couch. The terrier climbed into her lap. She put her hand on its head absently. She was, Eleanor saw, weeping silently, not loudly, the way Lady Vane did anything, with restraint. She said, "That is my son, Eleanor. That is exactly my son. Yes, Lady Vane. I have spent 5 years being angry at you because you were alive and he was not. That is the only reason. There has never been another. I have been a foolish, vain old woman. I will attend the wedding." Eleanor said, "Lady Vane, I will sit in the front pew. I will weep. I will tell anyone who asks me that my dead son's wife is marrying again to a man my son himself chose for her. Do you understand me, Eleanor?" "Yes, Lady Vane." "Will you bring the little girl to see me, next week, before the wedding?" "Yes." "She is my granddaughter. I have not seen her since she was a baby." "I know. That was my doing. I know. Bring her on Tuesday afternoon. I shall have shortbread." Eleanor laughed. She would not have, expected to laugh. The Dowager Lady Vane permitted herself, for the first time in 5 years, the smallest reluctant smile. She said to the Duke, "Your Grace, take care of her." The Duke bowed. "I intend to, Lady Vane. You will not survive otherwise." "I am aware, Lady Vane." They walked back down the stairs. In the front hall, Eleanor stopped. She put a hand on the wall, briefly, to steady herself. The Duke said quietly, "Eleanor," she said, "I am all right. I have just had something back that I did not know I had lost. Give me a moment." She gave herself a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with an expression he did not entirely recognize, until he did. It was the expression she had worn at 20, the morning he had asked her to walk with him in St. James's Park, the morning he had been the most certain of his life that they would marry inside a year. He had not seen that expression in 8 years. He had been waiting for it. She said, "Now, my daughter." He said, "Yes." They went back to Smithfield together. The Duke had wished to take her in his carriage. Eleanor had refused. "I want Catherine to meet you the way she will meet you for the rest of her life, on our doorstep, on foot, without spectacle." They walked. It was 8 in the morning. London was beginning to wake. The streets smelled of bread and horse and coal smoke. At the door of Walker's bookshop, she stopped. "Adrian, one thing." "Yes." "You will not, please, perform with her. She is 6. She does not know yet what a duke is. Do not bow. Do not speak grandly. Speak to her the way you spoke to me last night in the corridor, like a person who has been waiting 8 years to meet her." He nodded. "I will." She opened the door. Mrs. Walker came out of the shop immediately. She had clearly been waiting. She stopped at the sight of the Duke. She curtsied very low. "Your Grace." "Mrs. Walker? Is Catherine awake?" "Awake, Mrs. Vane. She has had her bread. She is in the back room with the cat." "Would you give us 5 minutes?" Mrs. Walker, who had not in 5 years of letting rooms above her shop ever been told to give 5 minutes to anyone, retreated into her shop and closed the door behind her with elaborate quiet. Eleanor led the Duke through to the back room. Catherine was sitting on the floor by the small fireplace. The shop cat, a thin ginger creature named Lord Byron, was draped across her knees. She was reading aloud to him from a book that was upside down. She looked up when Eleanor came in. She looked at the Duke. She did not, as Eleanor had feared, freeze or stare or weep. She closed her book. She placed it carefully on the floor. She set Lord Byron down. She stood up. She straightened the front of her small gray pinafore. She said, "Are you the Duke?" The Duke said, "I am." "What is your name?" "Adrian." "My name is Catherine. I am 6. My father is dead. He was Captain Edward Vane of HMS Berwick." The Duke went down on one knee, like a man bending to a child's height. He said, "I know who your father was, Catherine. He was a great man. I have heard many people say so." "You knew him?" "I did not know him. I knew of him. I was in Spain when he died. I read the newspaper." "Did you cry?" The Duke paused. He said, "Yes, I cried." "Why?" "Because he was a good man, and good men should be cried for." Catherine considered this with the gravity of a magistrate. She said, "Mama said you came to the palace last night." "I did." "Mama said you asked her to marry you." "I did. In front of 15 ladies." "In front of 15 ladies. Why?" The Duke looked at her. He looked at Eleanor. He looked back at Catherine. He said, "Catherine, I loved your mother 8 years ago. I went to Spain for 4 years, and I thought about her every day. I came home, and I went to the palace last night, because I was afraid that if I asked her privately, she would say no. So I asked her loudly, so that she would have to think about it. I am sorry, Catherine. It was a thing a man does when he has been waiting too long. I should have asked you, not the 15 ladies." Catherine considered this. She said, "Mama said yes?" "She did, this morning. She said yes this morning at the side gate. Then we shall live in a different house. We shall live in several different houses, Catherine, because I have several. You may pick the one you like best. Will I have my own room? You will have your own room, in every house. You may decorate them however you like." "With horses?" "With horses." Catherine turned to her mother. "Mamma, he says I can have horses on the wall." Eleanor laughed. "Yes, Catherine." Catherine turned back to the Duke. She walked up to him. She put her small, grubby hand on his sleeve, on the dark fabric of his very expensive coat, and she said, with the absolute seriousness of a person concluding a treaty, "You must come on Wednesdays. Mama works on Wednesdays. Mrs. Walker is nice, but she smells of cabbage. You should come on Wednesdays and take me to the park. Lord Byron may come if there is no large dog. Do you agree to my conditions, Mr. Duke?" The Duke of Ashbourne, who had negotiated the surrender of a fortified town in Salamanca, who had been received twice at the Spanish court, who had once outweighted Wellington himself across a chessboard, solemnly extended his hand to the 6-year-old daughter of Captain Edward Vane and Mrs. Eleanor Vane. "I agree to your conditions, Miss Catherine." She shook his hand. She picked up Lord Byron and her book. She walked out of the back room. In the doorway she stopped. She turned around. She said, "Mama?" "Yes, Catherine. He is nice." "I know, Catherine. You were right. Go and get your coat, Catherine. We are going to the palace to tell the Queen." "All 3 of us?" "All 3 of us." "Lord Byron also?" "Lord Byron stays here." Catherine accepted this. She left the room. When the door closed, the Duke rose to his feet very slowly. His face, when he looked at Eleanor, was wet. She had not seen him cry before. She walked to him. She put her hand against his face. She said, "It is all right, Adrian." He said, I have not in 8 years. I know. She is the most extraordinary person I have ever spoken to." "I know, Adrian. I love her already. I know that too." He took her hand from his face, and he held it. The way one holds a thing one has been wanting to hold for a long time and has not been sure one would be permitted to. He said, "Eleanor." "Yes." "I am going to be a good husband to you, and I am going to be a good father to her. I am terrified, Eleanor, of being a father. I have never done a thing in my life that mattered as much as this is going to. I will be careful with her. Eleanor put her arms around him. She did not cry. She had cried enough for one lifetime, last night, with both letters on the table. She said into his shoulder, "I know you will, Adrian. We have got the rest of our lives." Queen Charlotte received them at noon. She had not slept. She had spent the morning in correspondence with the Earl of Bevington, who was demanding an audience to lodge a formal complaint on behalf of his daughter, who had been publicly humiliated. She had spent the morning with Lady Sophia Hartwell's mother, who was demanding compensation. She had spent the morning with the Lord Chamberlain, who was demanding to know whether the bridal audience had any legal standing as a state ceremony, or whether it had merely been, as he carefully put it, a personal initiative of Her Majesty's. She received them in the yellow drawing-room. She did not rise. She did, however, when Catherine Vane walked in solemnly between her mother and the Duke of Ashbourne, lift one ringed hand to her mouth. She had not, in 72 years, been told that the Duke would bring the child. She watched the three of them cross the room. Eleanor stopped 6 paces from the Queen. She curtsied. The Duke bowed. Catherine, who had been instructed in detail on the journey over, performed a slow, careful curtsy of her own. She said, "Your Majesty." The Queen said, "Child." Catherine said, "My name is Catherine Vane. I am 6. I came to be married also." The Duke behind her made a faint sound. The Queen, who in the course of a long reign had been delivered many surprises, including the news of 2 assassination attempts, a war with America, and a husband who had ceased to recognize her, leaned back in her chair and said, very seriously, "Indeed, Miss Vane, and do you approve of His Grace?" "He cried about my father." "Did he?" "Yes, I asked him." And he is going to put horses on my walls." The Queen looked at the Duke. She said, "Your Grace, the girl is 6 and she has negotiated better terms than several of my ambassadors. I assume you have agreed." "I have agreed, Your Majesty." "And Mrs. Vane, have you read the letter?" Eleanor said, "I have, Your Majesty, both letters." The Queen tilted her head. "Both?" "My husband wrote one also, Your Majesty. The morning he sailed. He told me, when I was ready, to marry the Duke." The Queen went silent a long moment. She said, "Captain Edward Vane was an extraordinarily intelligent man. I always thought so." She turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, I shall make an announcement at the next levee. I shall say that the Duke of Ashbourne, having attended a private interview at the palace last night, has formally requested permission to marry Mrs. Edward Vane, widow of the late Captain Edward Vane of His Majesty's Navy. The permission has been granted. The Crown has no further interest in His Grace's matrimonial arrangements. Anyone who claims that the bridal audience constituted a binding event will be invited by my secretary to consult their solicitor. Lord Bevington will not enjoy the conversation. I shall enjoy it considerably." The Duke smiled. It was the first time the Queen had ever seen the Duke of Ashbourne smile. She thought privately that he had perhaps not smiled often enough in the last 4 years. She said, "Mrs. Vane, you will on your marriage resign your post as court chronicler." "I had assumed so. I shall replace you with a Mrs. Drummond from the dictation pool. She is a steady hand. She will not, I think, be in a position to be carried off by a duke." Eleanor laughed. The Queen permitted herself a small, dry smile. She turned her eye to Catherine. "Miss Vane, have you been to a palace before?" Catherine said, "Mamma works in a palace, but she does not let me come. She says it is dull." The Queen said, "Mrs. Vane, the child is correct. It is very dull. Take her home. Marry your Duke. Send her to me once a year for tea. I shall have very small biscuits made." Catherine considered this with great seriousness. She said, "Your Majesty, may I bring Lord Byron?" The Queen said, "Who is Lord Byron, child?" "My cat." The Queen said gravely, "Miss Vane, I would be honored." They were married 3 weeks later. In a private chapel in Hanover Square, 42 guests, the Dowager Lady Vane in the front pew, Catherine Vane in a small white dress with embroidered roses, carrying a posy of late autumn marigolds, because they were what was available at the florist on the morning, and Eleanor refused to send to the country for hothouse flowers when there were good, honest London flowers on the doorstep. Queen Charlotte attended. She sat in the second pew. She brought as a wedding gift a small silver bell that had once belonged to her own mother. The Duke wore a deep green coat. Eleanor wore ivory silk. She had pinned a single late marigold in her hair to match her daughter's bouquet. In her inner pocket, the pocket of every gown she had owned for 5 years, now sewn into the wedding silk, she carried both letters, Adrian's and Edward's. She had decided that morning to bring them both to the altar. The vows were short. When the vicar said, "Till death us do part," Catherine, who was standing in the front pew between her grandmother and Mrs. Walker, said audibly, "And after." Eleanor heard her. She turned her head. She met her daughter's eye. She said audibly to the vicar, "And after, sir, if you do not mind." The vicar, who had married 36 couples in his career and had never once been interrupted, said with great gravity, "Indeed, Mrs. Vane, and after." The Dowager Lady Vane wept quietly in the front pew. Queen Charlotte, in the second pew, did not weep, but she lifted her ringed hand once, very briefly to her mouth. The Duke of Ashbourne kissed his bride. It was not a long kiss. He held her face in both his hands, the way Eleanor had remembered since the corridor in the palace that he had once held her face in St. James's Park when she was 20. He kissed her once, slowly. He rested his forehead against hers for the smallest moment. He said against her mouth, "Mrs. Ashbourne." She said against his, "Eleanor." He said, "I love you." She said, "I know, Adrian. I have known for 8 years, and you have been loved, all that time, by 2 of us." He went very still. She said, "Both letters are in my pocket, Adrian, both. Yours and Edward's. Both came to the altar with me. I wanted you to know." He could not speak for a long moment. Finally he said, very quietly, "Thank you, Eleanor." She said, "Thank Edward, Adrian. He told me to come. He has been waiting for me to bring you here, on the other side, for 5 years." The Duke bowed his head against hers. He stayed that way a long moment, long enough that the vicar, who had not been interrupted before in his career and was now twice in one ceremony, coughed gently. The Duke lifted his head. He took Eleanor's hand. He took Catherine's hand on his other side. The 3 of them walked together back down the chapel aisle. Behind them, in the second pew, Queen Charlotte of England turned to her lady-in-waiting and said quietly, "Make a note. The Duke of Ashbourne is, after all, an excellent judge of women. We shall remember this the next time we organize a bridal audience." The lady-in-waiting said, "Your Majesty," with respect. "Perhaps no more bridal audiences." The Queen said after a moment, "Perhaps, indeed, no more." 6 months later, in the Rose Garden at Ashbourne Hall in Hampshire, Eleanor sat on a stone bench in the late afternoon sun. She wore a pale green muslin gown. The maternity cut was deliberate. She was 4 months pregnant with their first child together. Catherine, 7 now, was on the lawn in front of her, trying to teach Lord Byron the cat to fetch a small wooden ball. Lord Byron was lying on his back in the sun and refusing. The Duke came out of the house. He sat down on the bench beside her. He had been her husband for 6 months. He had been the most reliable, present, attentive husband she had ever heard of. He had taken Catherine to the park every Wednesday. He had read her a story every night. He had, 3 weeks after the wedding, quietly endowed a small fund for the widows of naval officers, in Captain Edward Vane's name. He had not told Eleanor. She had found out by accident from Lady Vane. She had asked him about it. He had said, "Eleanor, he gave me you. I owed him a debt." She had not asked again. She put her head on his shoulder now, in the rose garden. She said, "Adrian." "Yes." "Are you happy?" He laughed. He said, "Eleanor, I am the happiest man in England. I have been the happiest man in England for 173 days. I have kept account." "You have kept account." "I have. That is faintly ridiculous, Adrian." "I know it. I have kept it anyway." She laughed. She said, "What did you do with the other 43 letters?" He went very still. "Eleanor, the unsent ones, from your desk drawer at Ashbourne Hall. I have not asked about them." He looked at her. He said, "I have not opened the drawer since I came home from Spain. Eleanor, I do not know what to do with them. They are letters to a woman I had not yet been allowed to know. I do not know if she should read them 6 months into her marriage. I do not want to make her sad with 8 years of my silence." Eleanor smiled. She lifted her head from his shoulder. She said, "Adrian, bring me the drawer." "Eleanor, Bring me the drawer, Adrian. I do not need to read all 43. I would like, perhaps, to read one. The one from the worst Christmas Eve. The one you wrote in the dark in Spain. That one. I should like to read that one. The rest we can put in the library and call them historical documents. The married daughters can read them in 200 years. The Duke laughed. He laughed properly. The way he had not laughed in 8 years, until, perhaps, last week, when Catherine had told a footman gravely that Lord Byron required a small porcelain dish, because he was used to better. He said, "Eleanor Ashbourne. Adrian Ashbourne. I love you. I know. Both of us did." He took her face in both his hands. He kissed her. In the garden in front of them, Catherine had given up on Lord Byron and was running across the lawn with her arms out like wings. The sun was warm. The roses were in bloom. Inside the house, somewhere, a clock chimed 5, 3 minutes slow, because the old grandfather in the front hall had always run 3 minutes slow, and the Duke had, 6 months ago, on the second morning of his marriage, quietly given up trying to fix it. He kissed her. She kissed him back. The roses bowed in the light breeze, and the world, in this rose garden in Hampshire in May of 1814, did not, for the first time in either of their lives, ask anything of either of them at all. If you have ever carried a letter for 8 years and not opened it, if you have ever been loved, quietly, by 2 good men, and only understood it after one of them was gone, if you have ever built a small quiet life in 2 rooms above a bookshop and told yourself it was enough, and then watched a man cross a room and name you in front of 15 heiresses and the Queen of England, then you know what Eleanor knew, and you know why it mattered. You are not alone in having been forgotten. You are not alone in waiting for the eyesight to find you. You are not alone in having been loved by people who did not need to be told. And in the world of velvet and thorn, the eyesight always, in the end, finds its way. If this story moved you, if Eleanor's 8-year silence, or Adrian's 43 unsent letters, or Edward Vane's 5 lines from the morning he sailed, or Catherine's 6-year-old wisdom, found something in you, take a moment before you go to subscribe, turn on notifications, drop one word in the comments, the word that broke you open. We read every single one. There is a new story every 2 days. Each one is a candle. Each one is for you. The next candle is already lit.